Steven Universe and all associated images are property of Cartoon Network, Rebecca Sugar, and any and all other respective owners. I don't know them all. All footage in this video has been used for the purpose of critique parody under fair use. Please support the official release. Welcome guys to my very first deeper analysis video of a Steven Universe related topic. I changed my mind regarding how I wanted to handle this series several times, which is why this first episode took longer to make than I had originally expected. Basically I decided that I wanted these videos to be shorter and more to the point than what I had originally envisioned, making them a little more accessible to people and making it easier to tie them together and make them feel more like a series. With all of that said, these are going to come out roughly once a month. They will not interfere with my theories. In fact, they are going to be integrated into the theory schedule so that I am releasing 4 major videos a month rather than just 3. Though there may be times when I switch out a theory here and there for an extra one of these, or switch out one of these for an extra theory. It really all just depends on what's going on at the time. These will also be a little more conversational than my theory videos, hence why I seem a little more conversational than in my theory videos. But let's get right into things by talking about Pearl. Pearl is a very interesting character. She's far more actively involved in the rearing of Steven than the other core Crystal Gems. She's constantly making her views and opinions known and exerting her will upon Steven. This is a pretty stark contrast to Garnet, who is very hands-off in regards to how she raises Steven, or to Amethyst, who is more like Steven's older sister than an actual caregiver. And yeah, Amethyst tries, but Pearl's actions are far more grounded in what she considers to be best for Steven, and as I already mentioned, she is far more active as a caregiver than Garnet. Despite all of this, however, even though Steven is the viewpoint character and through him you would expect that we would have learned a lot about Pearl by now, we know very little about Pearl above and beyond what is actually in the show, stated for us. We can't really infer much about her history or background. Thankfully though, aspects of her past have been revealed in recent episodes, otherwise this video would be pretty plain and basic. Pearl was one of the first Crystal Gems, the rebellious faction led by and presumably formed by Rose Quartz. In fact, back before the rebellion grew into an all-out war, Rose and Pearl were the only 2 Crystal Gems. We see in The Answer that, at the time at least, Pearl seemed to be confident and proud and almost like she romanticized what it was that she and Rose were doing. While it's possible that the events in The Answer were a little romanticized by Garnet, and that things didn't happen quite as we saw them, I see no reason to assume that they didn't until we're told otherwise. In that story, we see Pearl doing a lot of flourishes with her sword and posing and just overall seeming very sure of herself. She seemed to be ignoring the real peril of the situation that she and Rose had found themselves in, or she simply didn't know how dangerous those situations actually were. And this makes sense looking at what else we know about Pearl's background, which we'll talk about in a minute. Let's just say that Pearl had reason to be high on herself and to feel like she could do anything. However, we see later on in the present day of the series that things have changed. Pearl seems ashamed of her past, or at the very least not proud enough of it any longer to not hide the details of the conflict from Steven. This is likely because the war grew far larger than I think Pearl ever expected it to. I say Pearl, not Pearl and Rose, because I do think Rose probably expected the conflict to grow quite a bit more than Pearl realized it would. Rose was a tactician after all, but that's entirely off topic. I don't think Pearl considered at the beginning that she was entering into a real conflict or what that meant. Now, Pearl shows signs of PTSD stemming from her experiences during the conflict. But the gems and their relationship with PTSD is something that we'll be talking about in greater detail later on, so I'll leave that here for now. What's really interesting about Pearl is that her characterization is unlike anything else in the series. I don't always agree with her actions, and in fact I find a lot of them to be pretty despicable, but that is because her characterization is so nearly perfect. Everything that she does makes sense based upon who she is, and serves to make her one of the most three-dimensional characters I've ever encountered in fiction. First, it needs to be addressed that Pearls in Homeworld society are slaves. They're not servants, they're not butlers, they're slaves. I know that some of you are going to argue this point because people always do, but the description of Pearls in Back to the Barn is proof of this. As I said in my review of that episode, there are plenty of people more suited than myself to discuss the grave social injustice that is slavery, so I will be foregoing an in-depth discussion of the subject and just assume that you all know that slavery is disgusting, evil, and wrong. This is why it's understandable why Pearl was riding high at the start of the rebellion. She had just recently declared herself a person contrary to the views of her society, and taught herself to fight, contrary to her very design, which incidentally explains some of, and I repeat, some of, her controlling behavior. She fights hard to assert herself because in her past life she didn't have that freedom. There are real-world examples of escaped slaves who made something of themselves, and it certainly isn't an easy thing to do. They have to fight every day to reaffirm that the social conditioning telling them that they aren't people, that they aren't worthy, isn't true. This is even more true for a being like Pearl, who has had that indoctrination programmed directly into her head. While not being the same thing by far, so please don't accuse me of saying that it is, I can speak from a place resembling personal experience here as someone who has suffered from severe depression. When everything that you are is telling you that you are not worth it, the hardest thing in the world to do is to convince yourself otherwise. This explains a huge aspect of Pearl's personality, that being that she has very obviously barely contained feelings of inadequacy. It seems that she can usually fight them back and prevent them from affecting her on a day-to-day basis, which is very inspirational, I might add, but we have also seen those feelings take a huge toll on her, such as during the Sardonyx arc or in Rose's Scabbard when Pearl's perception of herself as Rose's most trusted confidant proved to be untrue. In fact, the latter situation almost broke her, not literally, of course. Which is the perfect segue actually into the final aspect of Pearl's characterization that I want to discuss today, her romantic feelings for Rose Quartz. It's unclear when exactly these feelings developed or how they developed, but I think that it's obvious enough that, contrary to other high-class gems, Rose saw Pearl as a person and treated her as such, inspiring the aforementioned feelings. It is likely due to these feelings, at least in part, that Pearl made the snap decision to join Rose in her fight for the Earth, against Homeworld, despite the fact that Pearl, in part to this day, still wants to go back to Homeworld and subsequently return to the life that she once led. Whether or not Rose returned or even acknowledged Pearl's feelings for her is a subject for another video, but regardless of that, it is obvious that just as her feelings for Rose led Pearl to join the rebellion, they also led to her attitude change in regards to the conflict. As the war intensified, Pearl began to fear for the life of her love, sacrificing herself repeatedly in an attempt to spare Rose from harm. As this continued, whether due to her programming as a Pearl or simply due to her newfound romantic desires, or a combination of the two, Pearl came to think of herself as less than Rose, less important than Rose, and came to feel that it was her responsibility to protect Rose rather than herself, and rather than acknowledging that it was Rose's responsibility to protect herself. This is where the rest of Pearl's assertive behavior is explained. In particular, her tendency to be so protective of Steven. Rather than any kind of maternal instinct, it is simply an extension of the protective behavior that Pearl developed towards Rose. We know that gems don't have children, so it stands to reason that any kind of maternal behavior in gems would have to be taught. It therefore, and especially considering that Pearl has no desire to look out for or protect baby Steven in the episode Steven's Birthday, stands to reason that Pearl's strong desire to protect Steven stems from the same desire to protect Rose which developed during the war, as we know that Pearl does, at least in part, see Steven as an extension of Rose. This means that while her protective attitudes towards Steven are often appropriate now as he is still a vulnerable child, eventually those behaviors could very well develop into something just as unhealthy as her behaviors during the war, as Steven grows older and more independently capable. This means that as the series continues, we will very likely get more episodes like Sworn to the Sword which deal with Pearl's unhealthy overprotectiveness, as well as her continued insistence upon placing others above herself. In fact, we have already seen Pearl growing a lot in those areas just in recent episodes. Which concludes my individual analysis of Pearl. There is, of course, more that we could talk about, but I feel like we've covered enough of the bases that anything else would just be rambling or speculation. Let's conclude with a bit of a summation, stating that Pearl is a flawed, sometimes very unlikable, but brilliantly realized three-dimensional character who is quite interesting and feels almost like a real person. Even when I don't like her, I can still find inspiration in all that she has accomplished and root for her growing and becoming a better version of herself, which is typically more than I even bother to ask for in a fictional character. I feel genuinely appreciative that this character exists for those very reasons. And frankly, I hope that you do too, just as I hope that you got something out of this video. Let's discuss Pearl in the comments section down below. This has been AJ22 and I will talk to you guys later. Do you have a theory idea or merely a musing about the show that you'd like me to discuss? You can head on over to my Facebook page and send me a message detailing your ideas, and if I find them interesting enough, I'll be sure to respond. Or you could head on over to my Tumblr page and send me an ask. If it's not something that I've covered before, I'll be sure to answer. If you are on Facebook or Tumblr, I also recommend that you like and or follow me there as well to keep up to date on all of my content as well as any supplementary content that I might post on either of those sites. And if you know anyone on Facebook or Tumblr who might find my content interesting, please share it with them. I'd really appreciate it.